Ukraine is a state in Eastern Europe, the second largest in Europe and the first entirely European. It is bordered by the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov to the south, Russia to the northeast and east, Belarus to the north, Poland, Slovakia and Hungary to the west, and Romania and Moldova to the southwest. The capital, and most populous city, is Kiev. The origins of Ukrainian culture date back to the medieval East Slavic state of Kievan Rus. After the latter's fall to the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the territory was partitioned and claimed by several foreign powers, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the west and the Ottoman Empire in the south. The Cossack Hetmanate was established in 1648 by Bohdan Khmelnytsky following an armed revolt against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. During its brief existence, the Hetmanate alternates between Russian and Polish suzerainty. In 1654, the Hetmanate is admitted within the Tsardom of Russia. In 1667, the Treaty of Androsovo recognized Russia's suzerainty over the part of the Hetmanate located on the left, eastern bank of the Dnieper, including Kiev. The Cossacks of western Ukraine remained under Polish domination. After being partially conquered by the Turks, the western part would end up attached to the Austrian Empire, to its successor Austria-Hungary, and then to the Republic of Poland. During the Russian Revolution, the Ukrainian People's Republic briefly gained independence with international recognition. It incorporated part of the former West Ukrainian People's Republic, before becoming the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic of the Soviet Union, in the 1930s-1920 following the Russian Civil War. In 1921, the Red Army definitively crushes the Ukrainian Revolutionary Insurgent Army, which had controlled 1918 the center, south and east of the country, putting an end to the libertarian Ukraine. 1939, the Soviet Union completes its conquest of western Ukraine, previously part of Poland, in accordance with the German-Soviet Pact. Ukraine becomes independent again in 1991, with the breakup of the USSR, and is then the third nuclear power in the world in number of warheads. The December 5, 1994, Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum in exchange for guarantees on its security and territorial integrity guaranteed by Russia, the United States and the United Kingdom. Following the revolution in 2014, Crimea is annexed by Russia and a civil war breaks out in the east of the country against pro-Russian separatists. Faced with the Russian threat and Russia's failure to respect its commitments to 1994, Ukraine then seeks new security guarantees by moving closer to NATO. The crisis takes on a new dimension on February 24, 2022, when Ukraine was invaded by Russian armed forces on the orders of Vladimir Putin. History. Ukraine is home to the first East Slavic state, founded by Scandinavians, Kievan Rus, also called Ruthenia in Western writings, which during the 10th and 11th centuries was the largest and most powerful state in Europe after the Byzantine Empire. Lithuanian-Polish period in the northwest, Turkish Tatar in the southeast. During the 14th century, the Poles and Lithuanians fought the Mongols, and eventually all of northwestern Ukraine came under the rule of Poland-Lithuania, which annexed Kiev in 1848. The Tatars remain in the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea and in Crimea. However, 1382 has 1484, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania reached the Black Sea near Okhotsk. Lithuania took control of Volhynia in northwestern Ukraine, including the regions around Kiev. As for Poland, it took control of Galicia. Further south, the Principality of Moldavia was its vassal. In these northwestern regions, in addition to the Ukrainians who were called Russins and Ruthenians at the time, the country included Poles, Moldavians, Germans, Armenians, Jews and Russians. As the Tatars lost ground, many towns and villages were founded. The nobility of western Ukraine was often Polonized. Polish legislation was introduced in western Ukraine in 1434. Although Poland pursues a relatively tolerant policy towards Orthodoxy, it nevertheless favors Catholicism, which is progressing in the western territories of present-day Ukraine. Polish influence penetrated more slowly into the territories belonging to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Orthodoxy retained its predominance there. However, the balance of power within the Polish-Lithuanian state turned to the advantage of the Poles. The Union of Lublin consecrates the triumph of Poland. Lithuania loses most of its Ukrainian possessions. The nobility of these regions becomes Polonized and converts to Catholicism. A part of the High Orthodox clergy is tempted by rapprochement with Rome. The Metropolitan of Kiev and a part of the high clergy, in reaction to the reforming interventions of the Patriarch of Constantinople, rallies to Rome at the Council of Brest in 1596. The union of the Church of Kievan Rus with Rome formed the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as part of the Uniates. It was during this Lithuanian Polish domination, from the 15th century, that the Cossacks were formed, Orthodox Ruthenian peasants who refused servitude and assimilation to the Catholic Poles. The Kingdom of Poland tolerated them and used them against the Tatars, then, from the 16th century, against the Ottoman Turks, who became overlords of the Crimean Tatars. The first confirmed mention of the Ukrainian Cossacks dates back to 1492, when they attacked a Turkish ship to free their captives. 21 The Zaporozhian Cossacks formed an independent structure during the time of Dmytro Vishnevetsky, in the middle of the 16th century, when he built the first Sich on the island of Khortytsia in the center of modern Zaporizhzhia to protect the Ukrainian lands from constant attacks by the Tatars and the Turks. The divide between the Northwest, Orthodox but with Polish and Lithuanian, that is, Western, influence, and the Southeast, subject to the Tatars and Ottomans, then conquered and colonized by the Russian Empire, is still reflected in the political structure of the country today. The Northwest votes more for pro-Europeans and is wary of Russian influence, while the Southeast votes more for pro-Russians, is wary of Western influence often assimilated to fascism since the Second World War and can even rise up against the power of Kiev when the latter draws closer to the West. Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. After in 1647 the Polish nobleman Danilo Chapliński attacked Bogdan Khmelnytsky's farm in Subotiv, during which he tortured Bogdan's young son and captured his wife, Khmelnytsky went to the Sich. It was then already the fourth Sich, Mykitynska, on the territory of present-day Nikopol. The Ukrainian Cossacks chose him as their hetman. In early February 1648, they broke the siege of the Polish army near Sich and raised the largest Cossack uprising in history. This is how the hetmanate appeared. As a result of the anti-feudal peasant revolution, known in history as Khmelnykyna, the eastern part of Ukraine was emancipated from Lithuanian rule and constituted as an autonomous Cossack caste state. The Cossack hetmanate, administered by Cossack chieftains and headed by an elected hetman, was established and lasted for over a century despite pressure from Polish and Muscovite invaders attracted by the rich and fertile lands. It was at this time that a distinct Ukrainian nation emerged. The period after the death of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, considered to be from 1657 to 1687, marked by civil unrest, the division of the territory along the Dnieper between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Moscow state following the Treaty of Andrusovo, and Turkish intervention, was called Ruins. The territory of the Zaporozhian Cossacks on the Sich was initially jointly ruled by both sovereigns. In 1700, the Ukrainian Cossack army on the right bank of the Dnieper, which was under the rule of the Poles, was liquidated, as a result of which the hetmanate continued to exist only on the left bank of the Dnieper under the protectorate of Russia. The Russian authorities regularly sent Ukrainians to forced labor in the depths of the empire and tried to destroy the Cossacks, which caused the indignation of the Ukrainians. In 1708, during the Northern War, the Swedish king and his army attacked Ukraine, as a result of which Hetman Ivan Mazepa decided to conclude a new alliance, already with Sweden. Hetman was supported by the Cossacks. Therefore, the Russian Emperor Peter I ordered the destruction of the capital of the Hetmanate Baturin and Sich. In the decisive battle near Poltava in 1709, the Swedish-Ukrainian army was defeated due to the inequality of forces. Ivan Mazepa and Charles XII retreated to the lands of the Ottoman Empire along the Dniester River, in the city of Benderi, and died in exile 31. After Mazepa's death in 1711, Ukrainian Cossacks led by Kost Hordyenko elected Pylyp Orlik as the new hetman, who introduced the first Ukrainian constitution, which some historians consider to be the first constitution in Europe, according to which power in Ukraine was divided into three branches of authority: executive, legislative and judicial. After the death of General Hetman Skoropadsky in 1722, on the orders of Russia, Pavlo Polyabitko was elected hetman, who was soon sent to St. Petersburg, and in his place was created the small Russian Collegium, an executive body consisting of 6 Russians. But as soon as a new threat arose from the Ottoman Empire in 1727, the Collegium was liquidated and Danilo Apostol was elected hetman in order to gain the favor of the Ukrainians. Polyabitko agreed with the Russian authorities on the decisive points that relative autonomy was restored in the northeastern part of Ukraine. Kirill Razumovsky became the last hetman of Ukraine. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, abolished the hetmanate in the mid-18th century and destroyed the Sich in the last quarter of the 18th century, later transforming the Ukrainian population into serfs. The policy of Russification was carried out. It was officially forbidden to use the Ukrainian language and to teach it. The divisions between the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire. The partition of Poland allowed it to recover practically the entire right bank of the Dnieper, with the exception of Galicia, which came under the administration of Austria, which would later become 1867 the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The large uncultivated steppes of the south, in New Russia, were colonized by peasants from all over the empire, but also from Germany, notably the Mennonites, or from Holland, called by the Empress in exchange for tax privileges. The port of Odessa, whose name was chosen after that of Ulysses, initially governed by the Duke of Richelieu, was founded at this time tinged with a return to Greek sources. Before the arrival of Russia, on the territory of Odessa and Mykolaiv, there were ports founded at the time of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and on the territory of Kherson, before the official date of its foundation, in the 16th century, there was the city of Bilikhofichi. As you know, the Russian authorities changed the names of the colonies. Like other peoples in Europe, a Ukrainian national revival movement emerged in the Russian Empire from the middle of the 19th century. But St. Petersburg believed that this movement was being manipulated by the Poles. National circles were suppressed and printing in Ukrainian was prohibited. Russian elites considered Ukrainians to be Little Russians. Ukrainian culture experienced a renaissance in the mid-19th century, in parallel with the regionalist movement at the same time in Europe. This movement was concentrated in the regions of Ruthenia, Volhynia, or Podolaya and around Zaporozhye. It was then that the term Ukraine appeared more and more often, Ukraina meaning on the march, a term used mainly in the ecclesiastical language since the 16th century, revived by intellectuals at the end of the 19th century. The Russian imperial power officially did not recognize this term Ukraine. It formed in the territories of present-day Ukraine, as everywhere else in the empire, with the exception of the Grand Duchy of Finland treated differently, only different governments or provinces, Government of Kiev, Government of Chernigov, Government of Ekaterinoslav, Government of Kherson, etc. Within several entities, Little Russia, New Russia corresponding in part to the territories taken from the Ottoman Empire, parts of Bessarabia, etc. In 1876, the empire banned the Ukrainian language in schools, and restricted it in newspapers and literature. This restriction in turn provoked an ideological claim that helps to understand the current linguistic opposition. The different forms of Ukrainian are now spoken only by a fringe of the peasantry and certain cultivated circles of regionalists, teachers, academics, ecclesiastics. Large cities were founded under the Russian Empire, such as Odessa, a cosmopolitan port with a large Jewish minority, and Ekaterinoslav, Sevastopol, etc., which welcomed migrants from all over the empire, and even from Central Europe, from Austrian Poland or Germany. 1892, Kiev has almost 500,000 inhabitants. Indeed, after the abolition of serfdom in the Russian Empire in 1861, industrialization causes a rural exodus of Russian, Ukrainian, Ruthenian, etc. peasants to the new industrial centers. Trade develops in parallel with the extension of the railway and this great march towards the south and the west. Independent Ukraine. At the outbreak of the First World War, the Russian Empire extended to Poland, which it had covered since the last partition of Poland at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. During the years that followed, while Germany was stuck in a war of position with France on its western front, in the east it recorded great military successes against a Russia that was bled dry and faced with revolution. After the February Revolution, which ended the Russian Empire in 1917, Ukraine is briefly independent until 1920, but the Rada was unable to effectively control the territory, which was first invaded by the Germans and then, after their withdrawal, became a battlefield between the Bolshevik Party, the White Russians and the forces of the Triple Entente. March 4, 1917, most political parties agreed to form the Central Rada. The March 17, while still in Moscow, Mikhailo Hrushevsky was elected chairman of the Central Rada. Under his leadership, Ukraine proclaimed its autonomy on June 10, 1917 as head of the USDRP. Volodymyr Vinichenko was chosen as one of the two deputy speakers of the Central Rada and then as the first chairman of the General Secretariat of the Central Rada of the Autonomous Government of Ukraine. November 20, 1917, 13 days after the Russian Bolshevik Party overthrew the Social Democratic government in St. Petersburg, then the capital of Russia, the Ukrainian Central Rada proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic and its separation from Russia. The full independence of Ukraine was confirmed on November 22, and Mikhailo Hrushevsky was officially elected president of the Ukrainian People's Republic on April 29. And 1917 the German army advances to reach Riga and conquer Galicia and Bukovina, forcing Russia to suspend hostilities and negotiate. Under the cover of defending the free disposition of the Baltic provinces, Finland, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, the German government seeks to enlarge its zone of influence in the east and in particular to take control of the Ukrainian mining basins. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on February 9, 1918 between the governments of the Central Powers led by the German Empire and the young Ukrainian People's Republic, which emerged from the February Revolution, in the city of the same name, now Brest, in Belarus. The Russian Bolsheviks were not involved. The March 17, 1918, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was founded in the east of the country with Kharkov as its capital. To combat the Red Army that controlled eastern Ukraine, the Central Rada sought support from the Germans, who staged a coup d'état and overthrew Vinichenko's government, replacing him with Pavlo Skoropadsky, who, on the contrary April 29, 1918. On the very day of the election of Mikhailo Hrushevsky as President of the Republic, he was proclaimed Hetman of the Ukrainian state, Ukrainska Держава. In autumn 1918, foreseeing the German defeat, Skoropadsky tried to get closer to the Entente and the White Russians by promising to re-establish the federal union between Russia and Ukraine. But, left without support, Skoropadsky was overthrown by the popular movement, led by Simon Petliura, who took back Kiev. The German occupation troops abandoned the Hetmanate, and the new Ukrainian power let them return to their country without hindrance. Finally, the December 14, 1918, the Ukrainian People's Republic was re-established with Vinichenko at its head as chairman of the Ukrainian Directorate. 1918 has 1922, a significant part of the Ukrainian territory in the south is controlled by an insurrectionary peasant army of libertarian communist inspiration nicknamed Makhnovchina after its initiator Nestor Makhno, having counted at its peak nearly 100,000 fighters. Opposed to the White and Red armies, the Black Army will try to install in the controlled territories a system of collectivization of land and direct and decentralized democracy. November 11, 1918. The armistice is signed on the Western Front at Rethons between Germany and the Allies. The Armistice of Rethons cancels the Armistice of Brest-Litovsk. Article 12 of the Armistice Agreement provides that German troops evacuate all territories that are part of Russia by August 1, 1914, as soon as the Allies judge the time to be ripe, taking into account the internal situation in these territories. The Soviet period. At the end of 1918, the Allies intervene in southern Ukraine to support Denikin's White armies in the Russian Civil War. Odessa, Sevastopol, and other coastal towns are occupied by the French, but the intervention is cut short due to the lack of resources committed and the hostility of the population. Ukraine is invaded by the Red Army and brought back into the Soviet fold. The former breadbasket of the Russian Empire, now a Soviet Socialist Republic, supplies Soviet urban centers. The December 30, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was born from the treaty which united the RSFSR, Belarus, Ukraine, and Transcaucasia. In the conflict which opposed the Communists of the Center and the National Communist parties, it was the Center which won and imposed a federation. When Stalin launched his Industrial Revolution in the late 1930s-1920, Ukraine became one of the indispensable sources of its financing. The years of industrialization were marked by the construction of what was at the time the largest hydraulic power station in Europe on the Dnieper, which contributed to the electrification of the Republic, as well as a significant development of the large mining and metallurgical basin of Ukraine, the Donbass, already exploited since the end of the 19th century. After a brief period of Ukrainization, the so-called indigenization policy in the 1960s-1920, resulting in the return to Ukrainian in publications, the reopening of schools and universities with teaching in Ukrainian and the promotion of national cadres, Stalin spared no effort to suppress the slightest sign of a Ukrainian nationalist revival, interpreted as a rejection of Bolshevik power and a threat to the integrity of the USSR. To counter Ukrainian nationalism, the Soviet power favored neighboring Belarus. In addition, Russian oblasts, such as Kharkiv, were integrated into the Ukrainian SSR to strengthen the weight of Russian speakers. Moscow sought to firmly attach Ukraine and make it a fortress of the USSR, in Stalin's words. Any form of disloyalty on the part of Ukrainian intellectuals, communists, or peasants was eradicated. Between 1931 and 1933, a series of famines and the intensification of dekulakization struck the Soviet Union and particularly ravaged Ukraine, which was the most fertile region in the entire USSR. Between 2.650 and 5,051 people died as a result of this famine. Ukrainians called it Holodomor or extermination by starvation. Although the Soviet government of Joseph Stalin was careful never to write that reluctant peasants should be exterminated by starvation, declassified documents show that it at the very least used these famines, if not knowingly provoked them, to break the Ukrainian peasantry and nationalism, even though the Russian people were also victims of the same famines. The European Parliament recognized in a resolution of 2008 the Holodomor as a horrible crime committed against the Ukrainian people and against humanity. Executions and deportations of Ukrainians accused of nationalism were organized during the Stalinist purges of 1937 to 1939. Several million Ukrainians were executed or sent to Soviet labor camps, as were all those suspected of so-called bourgeois nationalism, the Russians first and foremost. In addition, the Marxism-Leninism applied by the Kremlin advocated state atheism and attacked religious symbols, destroying churches and cathedrals throughout the USSR, and millions of believers, mostly Orthodox, but also of other Christian denominations, were sent to the Gulag. All religions, even minority ones, were banned. In September and October 1939, after the partition of Poland between Nazi Germany and Stalinist USSR, Polish regions with a large Ukrainian minority such as Galicia and Lwów, now Lviv, were annexed by the USSR and incorporated into Western Ukraine, in accordance with the secret protocols of the German-Soviet Pact. According to Sabina Dulin, these secret protocols, which accompanied, between August 23 and September 28, 1939, the German-Soviet Pact signed by Stalin with Hitler, are the matrix of the Great Patriotic War. They will remain a real taboo until the end of the Soviet Union. This imperialist division with Nazi Germany in fact transgresses the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist code of honor upheld by the Soviet regime. In June 1940, it is the turn of northern Bukovina and Budjak, taken from Romania, to be taken by the USSR. In the summer 1941, Ukraine is invaded by the German armies. Upon their arrival, the Germans are received as liberators by a part of the Ukrainian population, especially that of the part of Poland invaded by Stalin in 1939, then integrated into Ukraine. But, as they progressed towards the east of the country, and in particular because of the mistreatment inflicted on the population, the German occupiers encountered strong resistance from the local population, which continued until the return of the Soviets in 1944. In retaliation, the Germans hunt down the partisans, burning hundreds of villages and thousands of houses with their inhabitants. The Jewish population of Ukraine is wiped out by the implementation of the final solution. April 28, 1943, the High Command of the Wehrmacht announces the creation of the SS Galicia Division made up of Ukrainian volunteers. Historians estimate that more than 220,000 Ukrainians enlisted alongside the German forces during the Second World War to fight the Soviet regime. In 1944, the Red Army liberated most of Ukraine. In June 1945, Subcarpathian Ruthenia, taken from Hungary, which had acquired it in 1939 on Slovakia, in turn joined Soviet Ukraine, forming the Transcarpathian Oblast. By the end of the conflict, the Ukrainian casualties stood at around 8 million, of which 1.377 million were military personnel. As for the independentists, present mainly in the western regions, they continued local armed resistance against the USSR until 1954. The June 26, 1945, Ukraine became one of the founding members of the UN, obtaining, in recognition of its role in the victory over Nazism, along with Belarus, a place separate from the USSR. This special provision allowed the Soviet Union to benefit from additional votes in the votes of the UN General Assembly. In 1954, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who spent his youth in Ukraine, transfers the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic to mark the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which united Russia with the provinces that formed the then Ukraine. Ukraine is considered a model of Soviet republics. Notably, Leonid Brezhnev, the main leader of the USSR for 18 years between 1964 and 1982, is of Ukrainian origin. The end of the Soviet period is marked by 1986 by the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, the human and financial cost of which was considerable. The USSR undertook a huge amount of decontamination work to mitigate the consequences of radioactivity. The exit from the Soviet Union. It's only towards 1989 that the liberalization of the Soviet regime and the release of political prisoners allowed Ukrainians to organize themselves to defend their rights to sovereignty. 1989, the Ukrainian National Movement, RUK, was created. During the elections of March 1990, the Ukrainian parties of the Democratic Bloc then obtained about 25% of the seats in parliament. Under the influence of the Democratic deputies, the parliament adopted, the July 16, 1990, the Declaration on the Political Sovereignty of the Republic of Ukraine. This is the first step towards the complete independence of Ukraine. This was proclaimed on August 24, 1991 and confirmed by the referendum of December 1, 1991. 92% of voters vote in favor of independence. The December 8, 1991, the breakup of the USSR was confirmed by the Minsk Agreement, signed by the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian leaders. Ukraine becomes one of the founding members of the Commonwealth of Independent States. By the Budapest Memorandum on Security Guarantees, signed on December 5, 1994, Ukraine gives up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for the guarantee of its territorial integrity by the United States, the United Kingdom and Russia. Large-scale invasion of Ukraine since 2022. The February 24, 2022, Russia carries out cruise and ballistic missile bombardments on several Ukrainian cities, including Kiev. Russian ground troops enter Ukrainian territory, which is the starting point of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine applies to join EU on February 28, 2022, 4 days after the start of the Russian aggression. At the European Council of 23 and June 24, 2022, the heads of state and government granted Ukraine candidate status for European Union membership. The September 30, 2022, the President of the Russian Federation claims the annexation, not recognized by the UN, of the Ukrainian regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia during a ceremony at the Moscow Kremlin. At the 2023 NATO summit, the alliance declared that Ukraine's future is in NATO without giving a timetable. Geography. Ukraine has several historical regions, some of which, such as the Carpathian Ruthenian Oblast or the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, may correspond to a current administrative subdivision. Some of these historical regions, such as Volhynia and Galicia formerly Polish-Lithuanian, Bukovina formerly Moldavian, or Myatide formerly Crimean Tatar also extend into neighboring countries. Others are entirely Ukrainian, Podolaya formerly Polish-Lithuanian Budjak and Yetisen formerly Turkish, Taurida and Crimea, formerly Tatar under Turkish suzerainty. The largest of the historical regions is Zaporozhia, the land of the Cossacks of the same name, inherited from the rapids of the Dnieper. Languages. Ukrainian has been the only official language since a law came into force on July 17, 2019. It is the only language that has since been authorized to be used by national, regional, and local authorities and institutions, as well as by businesses. However, the legislation provides for the possibility of derogating from this obligation in order to preserve the rights of the indigenous peoples and national minorities of Ukraine. Currently, the only exception recognized by the Ukrainian state concerns Crimea, where the Tatar language is authorized as the language of the indigenous Ukrainian people. Russian is widely understood by Ukrainians. Most of them can speak the language fluently due to its proximity to Ukrainian. However, the 17% of Russian speakers are mostly present in the east and south of the country, which were part of the Russian Empire for over 340 years and the USSR for over 70 years, while Ukrainian is largely dominant in western Ukraine, which was part of Poland and Austria-Hungary. Among the younger generation, especially in the larger cities, the choice of English as a second language is becoming increasingly important. In the west of the country, there are minorities who speak Polish, Hungarian, Belarusian, Romanian, Greek, Yiddish, as well as Czech and Slovak. Deported under Stalin after 1945, the Crimean Tatars who returned home, mainly after 1989, mainly speak Russian. German, which used to be a minority language, that of the Germans in southern Ukraine, almost completely disappeared after World War II and the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe. Today, German is mainly taught at university. It is considered useful in the world of business, probably the third most widely taught foreign language after Russian and English. Since the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2014, and to a large extent since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, interest in the Ukrainian language, culture, and history has increased significantly in Ukrainian society. At the same time, there is a massive rejection and sometimes hostility towards the Russian language. Support for the idea of giving Russian official status throughout Ukraine or in some of its regions has reached its lowest level over the entire observed period. At the same time, Russia is pursuing a policy of forced Russification of the Ukrainian territories it occupies. In schools, education is conducted exclusively in Russian, even in entirely Ukrainian-speaking settlements, and Ukrainian textbooks are banned. According to a report by the human rights organization Human Rights Watch, Russia indoctrinates children attending schools in the occupied territories with anti-Ukrainian propaganda, and Russian officials have taken and continue to take measures to eliminate the Ukrainian language, in violation of a number of provisions of international law. Ukrainian children forcibly deported to Russia are also at risk of Russification. Policy. Ukraine is a parliamentary democracy with extensive presidential powers, although reduced in favor of the parliament. The President of Ukraine is elected by direct universal suffrage for a 5-year term, renewable once. He appoints the Prime Minister with the agreement of the Rada, which is the parliament. The unicameral parliament is composed of 450 deputies elected by direct universal suffrage for a 5-year term 4 years before 2006. The voting method is mixed because it combines both proportional voting and majority voting until 2006, then only proportional. The Constitutional Court reviews the constitutionality of laws and can be appealed to by, among others, the Supreme Court of Ukraine, the President, or the Parliament. Presidential election of 2004 and Orange Revolution. While the presidency was held by Leonid Kuchma, a former apparatchik of the Communist Party, considered corrupt and linked to mafia groups, the last presidential election took place on October 31 and November 21, 2004. Following suspicions of fraud and the more or less spontaneous popular pressure of the Orange Revolution, the Supreme Court annulled the result of the second round, which gave the former Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych the victory over Viktor Yushchenko. In the end, it was the latter, playing the card of Europe and liberalism, who won, although his opponent maintained his solid positions in the Russian-speaking and Russophile east and south of the country. Viktor Yushchenko takes the oath in January 2005. He then appointed as Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, a businesswoman who had entered politics during the time of President Kukma. Against a backdrop of mutual accusations of corruption, the September 8, 2005 President Viktor Yushchenko dismissed the government of Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, appointing Yuria Yekhanurov as governor of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in her place. Commentators such as Jean-Baptiste Naudet, a reporter for Le Nouvel Observateur, have estimated that one can observe, across several elections, a preference for pro-European candidates in northwest Ukraine, formerly subject to Polish-Lithuanian influence, and for pro-Russian candidates in southeast Ukraine, formerly subject to Turkish, Tatar domination and freed from it by the Cossacks and Russia. The following legislative elections took place on March 26, 2006. The Party of Regions of the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych obtained 32% of the vote, the bloc of Yulia Tymoshenko 22% of the vote, and the Presidential Party are Ukraine 14% of the vote. Parties that failed to obtain at least 3% of the vote were not represented in the Rada. The Orange Parliamentary Coalition, which was difficult to form after more than 2 months of debates, broke up on July 7, 2006, following the surprise defection of the socialist Oleksandr Moros, who was elected Speaker of Parliament with the support of the pro-Russian opposition. This defection led to the Socialists joining the Party of Regions, Communists, and the creation of a new majority alliance, this time led by former Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. Following the talks between Yushchenko and Yanukovych that began on July 20, 2006, the two former rivals agreed to sign the Pact of National Unity, which marks political concessions on both sides, among others, the submission to a referendum on the question of the country's entry into NATO. The Yulia Tymoshenko bloc group, once an ally of our Ukraine, which left the seat of the Rada on July 20 by demanding the holding of early legislative elections, did not sign the universal. It therefore becomes the official opposition. The August 4, 2006 the Rada has nominated the leader of the Party of Regions Viktor Yanukovych as the new Prime Minister of Ukraine. Yanukovych's candidacy was supported by 271 votes, out of 226 required. The April 3, 2007, President Viktor Yushchenko dissolved parliament and called new parliamentary elections. They took place on September 30, 2007, the results were as follows. The Party of Regions of outgoing Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych won 34% of the vote. The Yulia Tymoshenko bloc received 31% of the votes. President Viktor Yushchenko's Our Ukraine Self-Defense Party won 14% of the vote. During the early legislative elections of September 30, 2007, the bloc led by Yulia Tymoshenko came in second with 30.7% of the vote, gaining almost 8 points compared to the previous parliamentary elections in March 2006. Viktor Yanukovych's Party of Regions won the elections with 34% of the vote. After the first counts, the Yulia Tymoshenko bloc came in first and the OSCE declared that the elections had been held in a free and fair manner. Appointed Prime Minister by President Yushchenko, she did not, however, manage to obtain a majority on December 11, obtaining only 225 votes out of the 226 required. Proposed again for the post of Prime Minister, the Rada ratified his nomination as head of the government on December 18 in a second vote by 226 votes out of 450,92. The Rada was dissolved by President Yushchenko on October 8, 2008 following the 2008 parliamentary crisis in Ukraine. An early election initially scheduled for December 7, 2008 then the December 14, has been postponed to start 2009, at an unspecified date, due to the financial crisis. A new coalition was then formed between Volodymyr Lytvyn's party, the Yulia Tymoshenko bloc and Our Ukraine. Volodymyr Lytvyn was elected Speaker of Parliament, and he announced that the Rada would continue its work until 2012. The first round of the presidential election took place on January 17, 2010. Opposition leader Viktor Yanukovych received 35% of the vote, and Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko 25%. Incumbent President Viktor Yushchenko received about 5.5% of the vote. Viktor Yanukovych wins second round of February 7 with 49% of the vote against 45.5% for Yulia Tymoshenko. The OSCE announced that the vote had been transparent and honest. Mykola Azarov, a loyalist of President Yanukovych, becomes Prime Minister on March 11, 2010, following a motion of censure voted on 3rd of March against Yulia Tymoshenko. The presidential election of March-April 2019 brought to power the comedian and actor Volodymyr Zelensky, who, after having eliminated Yulia Tymoshenko in the first round, who had been the favorite throughout the year 2018, collected 73% of the votes in the second round against a Poroshenko weakened by 5 years of war and corruption. Presenting himself as an anti-system candidate, Zelensky led an atypical campaign focused above all on social networks, playing on the identification with the character of history professor elected president that he has embodied since 2015 in the television series Servant of the People. His detractors emphasize his populist overtones, his inexperience, and his virtual absence of a program. During his inauguration on May 20, Zelensky dissolved the parliament, where his party had no deputies, and called early legislative elections. This decision was considered unconstitutional by a section of the political class, including Prime Minister Volodymyr Hrozman, who resigned. The vote, which took place on July 21 with a turnout of 50%, Zelensky's party won with an absolute majority of 254 seats out of. Volodymyr Zelensky made the fight against corruption one of the main focuses of his presidency. To this end, he implemented numerous anti-corruption measures, including a law establishing the criminal liability of civil servants found guilty of false income declarations. This and several others were nevertheless invalidated in October 2020 by the Constitutional Court, which considered them too severe. This decision provoked demonstrations and a constitutional crisis. Zelensky nevertheless succeeded in getting the September 23, 2021 a law aimed at limiting the power of oligarchs, wealthy businessmen who influence Ukrainian public life, by registering them in a registry. Those concerned have 6 months to cease their political activities and sell their media outlets, failing which they are registered as oligarchs and subject to strict constraints, obligation to declare their assets, prohibition on financing political parties, meeting privately with senior officials or participating in privatizations. Zelensky is however criticized for having taken the head of the commission responsible for establishing the registry, which creates a conflict of interest due to his links with the oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky. He is also himself accused of tax evasion in the Pandora Papers. On the international level, Zelensky intends to relaunch dialogue with Russia on the Donbass issue. The beginning of his mandate is marked in this regard by successes, including unprecedented prisoner exchanges between Ukraine and the pro-Russian camp and the return by Moscow of the 3 Ukrainian ships seized during the Kerch Strait incident a year earlier. This policy of détente nevertheless displeases a part of public opinion, which demonstrates in the major cities of Ukraine to denounce a capitulation. The July 22, 2020, Kiev and Moscow nevertheless signed the longest ceasefire agreement since the start of the conflict. This was almost immediately weakened by gunfire from separatist territories, the July 27th, but Zelensky reaffirms his commitment to the agreement by attributing these actions to illegal armed groups. In April 2021, however, a turning point occurs when Russia concentrates troops on the Ukrainian border, in the context of repeated violations of the ceasefire. Breaking with his conciliatory position, Zelensky turns to NATO and the European Union, considering that Ukraine's membership in these organizations is the only way to end the war in Donbass. After a few weeks of tensions, Sergei Shoigu announces the beginning of the withdrawal of Russian troops on April 22, but these massively resettled at the border at the end of the year. Despite Zelensky's reaffirmation of his willingness to negotiate directly with Moscow, and the opening of discussions with the United States and European partners, Vladimir Putin finally launched his army to attack the country in February 2022. As the conflict continues, the legislative and presidential elections initially scheduled for October 2023 and March 2024 have been postponed indefinitely. Economy. Ukraine has a diversified economy, but still dependent on industries established during the Soviet era. It is an emerging free market, where growth was double-digit in recent years, until the Orange Revolution. Its natural resources revolve largely around agriculture. Another strong point of its agriculture, the country is also 7th in the ranking of world producers of cereals in the mid-1990s. 2010, dominated by the United States, thanks to strong growth. The agricultural sector is, however, in decline in other areas. Over the first 6 years of the decade 2010, the country has never regained its place among the world's 8 largest sugar producers. Mineral resources also play an important role. The economy is characterized by high inflation and still somewhat low economic returns. From a trade point of view, its main economic partner remains Russia, although Ukraine is trying to turn to the European Union countries that are geographically close to it. The country plays an important role in European gas distribution. In 2015, despite the war in Donbass, Ukraine remains dependent on Russia for 21% of its imports and 12% of its exports. The national currency, the hryvnia, was introduced in 1996 and helped reduce the hyperinflation that prevailed at the time. Of 1989 has 1999, GDP collapsed by 60%, from $467 billion international dollars to $172 billion, then rose again to $312 billion until the crisis of 2008, since which GDP has tended to decrease irregularly. In 2001, the government took the decision to speed up the process of joining the World Trade Organization, however the results were not as good as expected. The goal was to enter the WTO in February 2007, entry which was effective on February 5, 2008. The political crisis of 2006 could have affected the Ukrainian economy due to the length of the appointment of the Prime Minister. Investors were not really scared and the economy held up well. GDP growth in July 2006 was 9% compared to July 2005, industrial production increased, the banking sector expanded, thanks to the arrival of European banks. In 2009, following the financial crisis, Ukraine's GDP fell by 15%, one of the worst economic performances recorded during that period. Thanks to exports, growth resumed in 2010, but external conditions are likely to hamper efforts at economic recovery in 2011. Religions. The main denominations in the country are Christian, mainly Orthodox and to a lesser extent Catholic. There are mainly 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, a canonical autocephalous jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church 129, recognized as independent by the Patriarchate of Constantinople since 201, 8130, then by 3 other autocephalous Orthodox churches out of the 14 universally recognized autocephalous churches. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, canonically attached to the Moscow Patriarchate. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, whose dissolution was annulled by a local synod of June 20, 2019. Catholicism represents 9% of the population, or around 4 million faithful. It is mainly practiced according to the Byzantine Rite. Other Christian denominations from Protestantism or the Armenian Apostolic Church are also represented, but in very small numbers, about 1%. Islam, which is mainly the religion of the Crimean Tatars, unites less than 1% of believers, and Judaism less than 0.5%. Ukraine has a considerable religious heritage, some of it very old and, in the Carpathians, including wooden architecture up to the 15th century. A national census and preservation project has existed since 2005.